It's the final home stretch to November 5th, Election Day, and while many have waited for an October surprise, it might have already swept in with Hurricane Milton. Vice President Harris will be directly tied to how the Biden administration handles recovery efforts, and Republicans are ready to pounce on any shortfalls. Here to go on the record is Scott Tranter, Director of Data Science for Decision Desk HQ. Scott, as always, it's great to see you. Busy news week. Let's jump right into it. Vice President Harris and Democrats have accused former President Trump of politicizing the recovery efforts from Hurricane Helene. Now, with Hurricane Milton making landfall in Florida, how are voters going to respond to, this debate over hurricanes?
Well, we're already seeing it. Look, there are congressmen in North Carolina having to issue press releases about crazy rumors around this. You've got Donald Trump making accusations about FEMA funds being spent. VP Harris going around trying to get phone calls and get photo ops and things like that around. I think this is the news topic of the day. This is obviously something very presidential. Both candidates want to show that they can lead and be helpful in these situations. So this may be our October surprise, or at least our news event that carries the campaign over the next couple of weeks. I saw one thing just before we jumped on here is both candidates are making major reservations on the Weather Channel for their TV ad spend. So they're certainly going where the voters' eyes are.
Yeah, I remember in 2004, I grew up in Florida or in Orlando, and during the, that crazy hurricane season there, television was inundated with Kerry and Bush ads. So interesting to see this happen every 4 years. So I want to take a step back and look at maybe the broader picture. Scott, the latest polling from the New York Times and Siena College has Harris leading 3 points nationally. So how does this compare to other national polls? It seems like they're either deadlocked or she has a slight lead nationally.
Well, this is interesting because the last time the New York Times did a poll like this nationally, it was much closer. It wasn't Harris +3. So this is some movement for the New York Times since the last time they've done it. What we're looking at, though, if I were to look and say the last 30 days, we are looking at a very slight tightening among the polling aggregates. It looks like Harris has lost about a point in polling aggregates, which is we take all these types of polls and we aggregate them into one. And we see that she's tightening in battleground states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, where she still holds a polling average lead, but certainly giving up some ground over the last month. This New York Times poll, it's movement for them. It's a bright spot for her. But I think we're going to see a lot of polls over the next couple of weeks where Trump may be ahead by 1 or 2 points, or they're tied or not quite back and forth. It's going to stay in this tight margin, I think, through the end.
Well, and on that question about the swing states, I want to zero in on Pennsylvania. I understand that Decision Desk has now given, I think the last time I checked, Kamala Harris a 51% chance of winning that state. So is it really 50-50 in that state? Are they deadlocked?
It is. And I think it's going to bounce back and forth. When we talk again next week, she might be at 51 or Donald Trump might be at 51%. I think the big takeaway, and I can't stress this enough, at that percentage, it doesn't matter which candidate is at 51 or 52. From a statistical standpoint, no one should be surprised if either candidate wins the state. That's how close it is.
Right. So I want to move back to that New York Times Siena College poll. And that same poll shows a 2-point lead for Harris when voters were asked which candidate represents change. This change message certainly reminds many of us of former President Barack Obama's message of hope and change back in 2008. So is Harris's messaging working? And could this message of change in 2024 help her get over the finish line?
Yeah, I think her messaging's helped, but we can kind of see that in her unfaves. I mean, we've talked about this in the past. She has a net positive favorable rating. It's very slight, but it's certainly gone up since she's declared herself a candidate. Look, this is her message. It is specifically chosen to be in contrast with Donald Trump's message about how America's declining and only he can bring it back. It's voters are trying to decide from that perspective, but it's a deliberate choice on her part to kind of take that hope and change tact, and it worked for Obama in 2008, so it's worth a try for her.
Yeah, a lot of political observers and voters making that comparison. So turning back to Decision Desk, I understand that this past week, Decision Desk HQ forecasting has shown Harris's chances of winning November has dropped from 55 to 52%. So what's exactly driving this change? It seems like this is just a sign that obviously the polls are tightening.
That's exactly what it is. At this point, we're 25-ish plus days out from election day. The fundamentals of each state, those are static. Those are the same. The only new data we're getting is these polls, and we're getting fundraising numbers, and we'll get some new ones next week when the fundraising reports are in. But the polls have been tightening. And like I mentioned a little bit earlier, specifically in the upper Midwest, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Harris still holds a slight lead in all three of those states in the polls, but not as big a lead as it was a month ago. And that's where the model is really reflecting, that trend line down.
So I want to take a closer look at the Senate map. Obviously, a number of races in contention. Want to go to Wisconsin, where Republican Eric Hovde has made some inroads as he looks to unseat two-term incumbent Senator Tammy Baldwin, a Democrat. Scott, is this state's Senate race now seen as a toss-up for all intents and purposes?
Yeah, well, it's on the edge of toss-up. It kind of goes back and forth in our forecast simply because, Hovde's doing better, but he needs to be polling better than he is today if he's going to unseat an incumbent senator. We'll see what the fundraising looks like next week. He has certainly made some inroads from earlier this summer when, from a probabilistic standpoint, he was a long shot. I think it's going to be close in the end, but right now, Tammy Baldwin holds the advantage here.
I want to move further to the Southwest over in Arizona. Your forecasting shows Democratic Congressman Ruben Gallego holding an 8-point lead over Republican Kari Lake. Scott, is this polling accurate? I mean, could Democrats really have this big of a shot of winning Arizona?
Yeah, look, we get that question a lot. Here's what it is. There's 40 plus polls out of Arizona. So there are some outliers here, but you're looking at an average there, and that's been the consistent that we've seen across the board. The one argument against that not being an 8-point where it might be closer or Kari Lake might even have a shot is, Donald Trump has a slight advantage in the state of Arizona, both in the polling and probabilistic. Not nearly as an advantage as Ruben Gallego has over Kari Lake, but it's hard to think that you're going to have some Ruben Gallego Trump voters if Trump wins the state of Arizona. So that's the one data point to say it might be a little closer than that. But there's a lot of data to say, at least at the Senate race, it's looking grim for Kari Lake to pull one out there.
A lot of political observers and strategists I talked to mentioned that in Senate races like Montana and Ohio, it is very possible that we could see some split ticket voting there. Moving to Montana, for example, we see that Republican Tim Sheehy was caught on audio saying that young women are single issue voters on abortion. Now, those comments mirror those made by Ohio Senator Bernie Moreno last month. We know that, Scott, abortion rights, access to abortion, this has become a big issue, particularly for Democrats really using it to go on the offensive against Republicans. Senate Republicans, the Trump campaign, House Republicans trying to figure out their messaging on this. So, taking a step back, how could this issue, or do you see this issue having a major impact on the Senate race and really, on the race as a whole 2 years after the overturning of Roe versus Wade?
Look, I think we see some more saliency in Ohio than Montana on that issue, simply because there was, a contested ballot initiative around that and a lot more activity. It's not to say that the women voters in Montana don't care as much. It's just Ohio's a little bit closer. It's a little bit more politically charged there. That's kind of where the race is. Look, in Ohio, Bernie Moreno is behind, Sherrod Brown's ahead. John Tester is behind, whereas his Republican counterpart, Sheehy, is ahead. I think the Democrats in both those races are picking on the right issue. It's an issue they tend to win on, especially in that segment of voters. But I think it might pay off a little bit more for Sherrod Brown than John Tester.
So in order to flip the Senate, Democrats need to win at least one race that Decision Desk HQ's model has as likely Republican. Democrats have recently focused on Texas and Florida. It seems like that focus comes as Montana seems increasingly out of reach. So, is the strategy of focusing on Texas and Florida working, or is that a long shot at the end of the day?
It's a reasonably empirical long shot, right? Like if we look at all the other states, it doesn't get any better. Nebraska is, not a thing. There's two Senate races there. I know one of them, Fisher's race, looks like it's pulling close, but they're not spending money there because they know what we know is it's probably going to go Republican. That being said, Florida and Texas being the best shots, it's an outside shot. Depending on the day, it goes back and forth. Rick Scott has about a 3 in 4 chance of winning, so that's pretty good odds for him. And Ted Cruz is similar. Ted Cruz has about a 2 in 3 shot of winning. And it may get a little bit worse for him down the stretch. But both these candidates in both these states have won close races, and they're incumbents and they're well funded, and so that's why it's a tough uphill battle for Democrats. But you can't blame them for trying. This is their path. They do have to flip one of those two that you talked about, and so this is where they're gonna lay it on the line for the final month or so.
Yeah, Rick Scott and Ted Cruz, certainly no strangers to winning by very, very narrow margins. So keep that in mind when you're looking at those tightening polls out of those two red-leaning states. Scott, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And that's it for What's America Thinking. I'm Julia Manchester. Come back next week. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel.